Welcome to Plagiarism, How Can I Avoid It If I Don't Know What It Is, by me, Molly Doherty, proprietress of the SPH Writing Center. Let's get started with your basic dictionary definition of plagiarism. It's a little tortured, an act or instance of using or closely imitating the language and thoughts of another author without authorization, and the representation of that author's work as one's own, as by not crediting the original author. Wow, is that a mouthful? Basically, it's taking credit for doing work that somebody else produced. And it's a problem, and it's something that isn't tolerated in most all academic institutions and in many workplaces. Actually, this comes from, I learned this when I was doing some research for this, from the Latin plagiare, which means to steal or to kidnap. And those are words that you normally think of, at least kidnapping, as you're kidnapping a person or you're stealing someone's car. But I think it shows the extent to which we value ideas and academic product in this country by the seriousness that people take charges of plagiarism. Why should we care about plagiarism? For the reasons that I just stated previously, which is that individual work and thought is highly, highly valued in the U.S. and in other countries, and the way we show how much we value the contributions of other people is by honoring them, by acknowledging their contributions to establish thought and to research and to really any creative endeavor that any human being takes part in. That's really where it comes from, and it's the idea that everyone's intellectual work, their product, it has value. And it has value, you can say it has financial value, but primarily I just think it has essential value. And its essence is valuable. But also, and taken, okay, if you're going to look at it that way, you're also going to see it as offensive. If you're seeing that somebody's work is so valuable, you're also realizing that stealing that work is offensive, and it shows contempt for the work and for the output of other people. Often this is work that has cost them many, many hours, days, weeks, years in some cases of work and blood and sweat, and just to steal it shows lack of respect for them, and I really think lack of respect for yourself as well. It's not necessarily a matter of legalities, though that can figure into it, but to me, it's really about character and integrity, though it can turn into a legal issue depending on the situation. In academia and in other fields where individual thought and work and content is regularly produced, charges of plagiarism can ruin careers, has ended employment, and it's considered a very serious offense in the U.S. especially. But really, I think where it comes into play, the importance of individual thought is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Nobody's work comes from, you don't do any of your work in a bubble. Okay, everything that we know really is a compendium. It's accrued over millennia of people learning and growing and sharing their words and thoughts and ideas with each other. So I learn something, I share it with someone else, who then takes that little tiny bit of information and does something else with it, and so on and so on and so on. There's this great quote that you're seeing on the screen: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." This was ascribed to Isaac Newton, but apparently it was a relatively common phrase, and it was used in the Middle Ages, basically, by this monk, Bernard of Chartres, in this sort of ancient French language that was sort of like Middle English, I think, and very hard for people to understand. But it was basically you are a single person who then goes forward and learns and grows based on the work of other people. And again, that we all just sort of like continue and progress because of each other's encouragement and previous work. However, the problem here with plagiarism is that when people feel that their words, their ideas can be appropriated by others, it makes them less likely to share them, and then we're all sort of poorer for that. We all lose that resource when people start feeling that they can't trust their fellow human beings to acknowledge their work. Really, when you look at the idea of academic integrity as a concept, it's really just one of individual integrity. It's writing what you write. It's when you're borrowing or using the words of other people, you are acknowledging their work and their output. And everything flows from that. So all of the rules that we'll be discussing in these slides and in future modules really just flow from that. So see it as kind of from a bird's eye view, sort of as an overall concept, and that way if you ever have any questions, if you're looking at a situation and you're wondering what to do, think, okay, if I'm truly honoring the contributions of this author who I'm trying to figure out how to use it, what would I do just as a baseline? And that would be honoring their work and acknowledging their work. And that really will answer a lot of your questions. The minutia of some things, you can always drill down on the internet. It's very helpful. But in terms of the overall theme of acknowledging other people's work and honoring their contributions, that's really where everything flows from. There are issues of intentional and unintentional plagiarism. Students these days often are guilty of unintentional plagiarism, or what I hope is unintentional plagiarism, and this really just comes about by not really understanding the rules and not understanding the basic holistic concept that I just discussed, which is that it's about acknowledging other people's work. So when you inadvertently plagiarize someone's work or partially plagiarize it, as we will see in the next slide, for unintentional plagiarism, sometimes it's as simple as using somebody's words that you have pulled from a document of theirs, and then you give them credit, but because you have picked up the entire passage and you've used it word for word, you have in essence plagiarized the work, even though you are giving them credit for it, because you have not quoted it precisely. You are using it word for word, and you are basically copying their words. And so if you're going to use someone else's words for something like this, you need to put quote marks around it, and we're going to get into that in depth about how to do that. But this is sort of a partial plagiarism in this case. So the student picked this up, tried to use it, used it, and did put the author's name right next to it and thought she had done everything great, but she hadn't paraphrased it, and since she hadn't paraphrased it, if she was going to use it verbatim, she needs to quote it. The next example is a student who found a passage from a newspaper that directly related to a paper he was in the middle of writing, and he really liked the idea that he read there. He picked it up, he paraphrased it completely and accurately in his own words as he was supposed to do, but he didn't go to the next step, which was acknowledging the writer of the newspaper article. And so again, it was sort of a half measures sort of thing. He paraphrased it, which that was great, and that's what he should have done, but he needed to go that extra step and acknowledge the original work. And for the earlier student, she gave it, she did acknowledge the author, but she didn't paraphrase it or quote it correctly. Intentional plagiarism, we all know what this is. It's buying or stealing someone else's work from a paper mill, or just sort of appropriating it for yourself. Sometimes, and actually this does make you, a party to plagiarism if you share or lend your work to other people, or certainly sell your work to other people. And then there's just straight up copying, and sometimes people do it with their eyes wide open. They know exactly what they're doing. Those people, I don't like to meet them because it's upsetting to me. If you knowingly steal from someone else, I think it shows you to be someone who has sort of a lack of integrity and a lack of respect for other people's ideas. Going to the next slide. Is plagiarism viewed differently in other parts of the world? The answer is yes, and this is an issue that our international students who come to the U.S. and go to school in undergrad and graduate schools sometimes struggle with, because where they have come from, it might be seen completely differently. And so what we see as stealing, they see as sharing. From a book, a published author, a textbook author, someone, they're seen as someone who is to be honored, and they feel that like using their work is in effect honoring them and their scholarship, and it's not seen in a thieving sort of a way. Also, in parts of the world where people are encouraged to work collectively on things and to work as part of a group, it's the individual effort is not so highly prized. It's more, we're working on this goal together, and so again, we're just sharing our work amongst ourselves, and it's not seen as necessarily belonging to any one person. That's very different than how we see this in the U.S., where individual achievement, we tend to focus on that really more than we do anything else. In certain scenarios, you are encouraged to collaborate and to partner with other people, but in academics especially, people are encouraged to do their own work and to kind of really guard their own work, to share it with people as long as it's being acknowledged, but it's seen as their work and only their work. Here's some examples of what to cite. And so you see here on the first column, you need to cite someone else's words, even words that you have paraphrased, words you've summarized, things of theirs that you've quoted, ideas, photographs, key phrases, which we'll discuss in more detail later, what constitutes a key phrase. But those are all things that need to be cited, even when you've paraphrased somebody else's idea. Going back to that example of the unintentional plagiarism by that one student. For yourself, you don't need to cite your own words, your own ideas, etc., all those bullets that you see there, but you do need to clearly delineate when you have created, when you are reusing something that you have created in it for another venue. So if you are recycling work that you have done in another class and you're using it in a different class without making that clear to your instructor, that can be a problem. That's called self-plagiarism, and again, that's an issue that we're going to explore in depth later on. The exceptions to these rules are things that are common knowledge, and these are things that everyone knows to be true. Well, puppies are just adorable, aren't they? And mud is sticky, and most trees will lose their leaves and fall, and these are just things that we know, just from seeing, just with our own eyes. Also, there are just facts that we acknowledge and that are usually found in encyclopedias and on Wikipedia and things like that. Things like cigarettes are bad for you, and the war between the states ended in 1865, and that sort of thing. These are just facts as we know them. However, often people will take common facts and common knowledge and use it as a basis for their own work. So say, we all know that nicotine is addictive. However, a scientist wants to find out exactly how that mechanism of addiction works. And so he takes that common fact and he uses it as a basis for original work of his own. Okay, so that's an example, again, of standing on the shoulders of giants, as we were talking about. Also, opinions about common knowledge. I give the example here of the space shuttle, that everyone knows it costs a great deal of money. We all kind of assume that. But say this guy who wrote an op-ed piece in a local newspaper, he feels the space shuttle program is wasteful. So even though the common knowledge is that it's expensive, he has added on to that common knowledge his own opinion, which is that it's wasteful. So if you were, for some reason, writing about the space shuttle or about NASA for whatever reason, and you felt the need to cite this person, George Wilson, who I made up, who doesn't exist, you would cite him as someone who is critical of the space shuttle program. Now, this can be a little tricky, the next little bit, about common knowledge, such as the kinds of things that you find in encyclopedias or Wikipedia. Yes, that is common knowledge and it's been gathered there for your use. However, if you're going to pick that up, and it's like the other example I gave before of the student who lifted the information verbatim and didn't quote it, you need to either quote it with the little quoting marks around it, or you need to paraphrase it. You need to put it into your own words. Even if it's in an encyclopedia, even if it's in Wikipedia, if you're using the original sentence structure and the word sequence that the author used, because yes, somebody wrote that for the encyclopedia, for Wikipedia. You don't know precisely who wrote it, but they were a human being and they put those thoughts, those ideas in that particular configuration, and you still need to honor that contribution. And again, it goes to the basic integrity of other people's words, other people's ideas, even if they're people you can't readily identify. Okay, so you would cite Wikipedia, you would cite a hard copy encyclopedia if anyone still uses those. So if you're going, otherwise what you would do instead, if you're not going to quote it, you're going to cite it regardless. Remember, you're going to cite it even if you paraphrase it, but if you're going to quote it, you're going to put little quote marks around it if you're going to pick the whole thing up and you're going to cite it, or you're going to paraphrase it and you're going to cite it. The citation part that's not for that's not to be considered optional. You're always going to cite, but it's the question of if you're going to quote the stuff directly or if you're going to paraphrase it. And really, the thing to do in 9 times out of 10 cases is paraphrasing it, and we'll get into that further on. There's more ethical considerations here. Really, sources are not meant to substitute for your own ideas. They're meant to shore up your ideas or to provide a counterpoint to your ideas. So if somebody else has a different opinion and you want to give an example of someone whose opinion differs from yours, you would cite somebody whose information is different than yours. People who support your point, that's great too. But you don't want it to ever be just a paper, no matter how perfectly cited, no matter how ethically compiled, it's still just a bunch of other people's ideas. So the citations, the sources that you use cannot be substituted for your own work. Okay, and that's kind of a finer point, a finer line that I think you'll come to recognize and realize later, and certainly your professors will be able to point that out to you. The one exception in a case like that is something like literature review, in which you are reading a great deal of material and you're boiling it down and you're essentially summarizing it and compiling it for the use of other people. And that really is, it's all about other people's work in that scenario. But in general, you're going to be doing your own work, and you're going to be using your citations to make your work stronger and better. You're going to stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm just going to keep saying it. Okay, so going forward, even if a friend tells you that it's okay that you read their paper from last quarter or their test or whatever material they have, and you're really sure that you're not going to do anything unethical about it and use something that you shouldn't use, it's going to be very difficult for you, I think, not to be influenced by that. And so, better yet, just do your own research, do your own work, try not to rely on other people's work. You can discuss with your friends some of the points that they had, some of the issues that they thought were valuable. You can maybe look at your friends' citations for further reading, but try to avoid reading other people's things, because it's very easy to inadvertently quote someone, sometimes in a way that you don't even know that you're doing it. Also, for people who are working with tutors or editors, be careful how much help you accept. The point is to improve your own work and not to have this person essentially write your paper for you. And as great as that might sound, ooh, I'm going to get a great grade because I had the tutor do so much of the work for me or whatever. The problem with that is when you're done and you've maybe gotten a great, you've gotten a great grade in the class, you've gotten an A, that's great, but you haven't learned anything, and you're no better a writer than you were at the beginning of the quarter, and you're that much closer to graduation, and yet you're still not ready. So the point is to get better, not just to get good grades. Grades are great, but they're not going to keep you employed. No one in the great wide world really cares about your GPA. Once you're out in the working world, they want to know what you can do, and they really want to know that you can write. Here are a bunch of sort of true or false questions, a lot of myths that students tend to labor under, and this kind of goes to where the unintentional plagiarism can occur. That material in the public domain can be used without citing. That is incorrect. There's so many things that are in the public domain. Shakespeare isn't in the public domain, but would you plagiarize Shakespeare? I really would hope not, but technically, legally, it's no longer under copyright. So by that standard, if that's your metric for what is or isn't plagiarism, sure, go ahead, use it. No, absolutely not. You can't do that. There's also something called the fair use exception, and that has to do with financial compensation to the holders of a copyright of printed material. Has nothing to do with plagiarism. And don't say, oh, well, I used that material under fair use. Again, don't try to find ways around the rules. Look at the essential nature of what these rules are meant to evoke, which is the acknowledgement of other people's work. So if you're trying to get around it, oh, well, it's fair use or it's public domain or whatever, basically you're just trying to get away with using somebody else's work. Also, the idea that everything that's on the internet is for public use and it can be used without citing, again, that's completely false. There is a school of thought, and I can't give you chapter and verse on this, but there are people who say that even by publishing something on the internet, that it's almost a form of copyright. Some people go the extra step and actually formally copyright their information, but there are other people who believe that just by publishing it on the internet, that it sort of has this kind of common copyright or sort of informal copyright. I don't know, but I know that using somebody else's work on the internet can get you in a lot of trouble. Also thinking that encyclopedias or Wikipedia, because it's all common knowledge, doesn't need to be cited. Again, completely wrong. Okay, and going back to that earlier example about unintentional plagiarism, sorry if I'm repeating myself, but even when you're completely and accurately paraphrasing someone else's ideas, that's great, but you have to go the rest of the way and cite their ideas as well. Basically what you're looking for is this golden test. It's ask yourself this question: is my reader likely to think this information originated with me when it did not? If yes, then you have to cite it. I mean, you either wrote it yourself, you thought of it yourself, you developed it yourself, or you didn't. And it's just that simple. Now, if I know people get very worried about how to adapt other people's ideas into their own words, and we're going to get into that in great detail and help you develop that skill, because once you learn paraphrasing and how to do that fairly easily, a lot of the worries about plagiarism and whether unintentional plagiarism kind of fall away. It's almost like an inoculation against plagiarism, is learning how to paraphrase other people's material accurately, and we will be working on that. And again, and I know I'm probably being a broken record here, but don't just focus on obeying the rules, understand the intent behind the rules. And that way, if you're ever confused about the rules, just think, okay, is this the ethical thing to do? Am I appropriating somebody else's work? So don't get hung up on the location or the format or whether it's copyrighted or it's fair use or it's public domain, anything like that. Because whether or not it's technically legal or not legal, it's unethical. And if it's unethical, there are people in this world who take this very, very seriously, and you could be doing yourself a harm without even meaning to do it, or, well, even meaning to do it. But if someone finds out, it could be a bad thing for you. Here are my references that I used. One of them was an article that I found online. Another one is a very good book I like called Rules for Writers by Diana Hacker and Nancy Summers. But the one that I mostly, and then you'll notice that I did cite Wikipedia. There it is. But I primarily used throughout this presentation a book by Robert A. Harris, who writes incredibly clearly and well on issues of plagiarism. And I just the other day I ordered another book of his. He's amazing. But the book that I used to help inform this presentation was Using Sources Effectively, Strengthening Your Writing and Avoiding Plagiarism. And here's a picture of it. It's an old book. My version is an old book. I saw that there are newer editions that are kind of jazzier looking, but I don't really think that the content will have changed very much. Mostly it's just going to get a little nicer looking on the outside. It's just a great book, and I've used large parts of it. And actually, while I was doing it, while I was reading through the book, which I've read before, but I reread it, while I was reading through it, I was paraphrasing. I would read a passage, and I thought it was a key passage, and I would sit and I would write notes in my own words in my notes, and from that, so essentially I paraphrased large parts of this. In some cases, I quoted it directly, and throughout, I am saying that this is Robert A. Harris, who provided not just the background of certain slides, but also very active material that I used copiously throughout this presentation. This is the end of part 1. There will be further modules, and we will be discussing paraphrasing, certainly. We will be discussing self-plagiarism and when to quote and how to quote. If you're going to do actual quotation marks, a lot of students like to do that because they're so worried about plagiarism that they say, "Well, I'm just going to pick up the whole thing because I'm so worried and I don't really know how to paraphrase." We're going to fix that. You're going to learn how to paraphrase, and I'm going to make sure that you understand how to do it. So anyway, those will come in other modules, and until then, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.